Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. Today, we're going to be revisiting a topic that I talked about in my first video on this channel, which, if you haven't watched it, was on the subject of cryptids that may be going extinct before we actually discover them. To briefly cover what I talked about in that video that will relate to this one, I was frequently mentioning the Loch Ness Monster. I mentioned it because there are actually points in time where the Loch Ness Monster sightings have decreased, almost as a cycle. And we had experienced such a decrease recently that lasted for about 8 to 9 months, and this decrease got many believers and people who put stock in the legends of Loch Ness believing that perhaps the creatures had died off. However, within the past month or 2 months or so, we've actually had a resurgence of sightings, and actually we had a resurgence of videos and photographs. Specifically speaking, we have one new video and two new photographs that we'll be talking about in this video. We're going to be analyzing them, and we're going to be taking a look as to why these are important, which is ultimately because resurgence phenomenon in cryptozoology I think is very important, and we're going to just draw conclusions on them and see what we can find. Ultimately, a resurgence phenomenon like this is important because extinction is important. When we have cryptids in cryptozoology, it is a concern that they will die off if they do exist. Some of these creatures could be very fantastic, like the Loch Ness Monster, or like the Jersey Devil, or like Bigfoot, etc. And them dying off would be a very big disappointment. And when we have a resurgence phenomenon popping up, we have many things that it suggests. The Loch Ness Monster in particular has actually experienced several cycles of resurgence and disappearance within its time as a cryptid, which is very interesting because it suggests one of two things. If there are Loch Ness Monsters, it suggests that we are seeing a pattern in behavior, perhaps some sort of migrational pattern. I'm not entirely sure what that could mean, but it definitely would suggest a behavioral pattern that we haven't yet observed. However, if there are no Loch Ness Monsters, it could mean that this is part of a psychological phenomenon, and that people who are supposedly seeing these Loch Ness Monsters or are mistaking things for Loch Ness Monsters, interest dies out over time, sightings stop because people have lost interest and they stop seeing things, a hoaxer comes up, makes something that looks kind of cool, and the legend picks back up again, and people start freaking out about it again, and the cycle continues as such. Of course, not knowing if the Loch Ness Monster is real or not, I'm not sure what this means, if it's one of those, but it is definitely one of those two things, and I think that both are equally interesting. And I think it's another reason why research and phenomenon in cryptozoology is important to know about. Moving on from that, let's take a look at the actual photographs and video themselves. The first photograph comes from an encounter that a 28-year-old tourist from Manchester named Haley Johnson said that she had while she was visiting Loch Ness. Allegedly, Haley was looking in the direction of an area in which apparently people believe that the Loch Ness Monster frequents very often. I have not heard of this area, so I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that is what's being reported. And allegedly, she saw this neck-like object come up out of the water, very classic craning of the neck, Loch Ness Monster. She took her photograph, the object disappeared back into the water, the sighting ended there. A little background on the actual sighting. Haley Johnson is, young, she's 28, she's a tourist there. She describes herself as a skeptical person, but she did believe in the Loch Ness Monster legend prior to this encounter. She said that her own opinion was that the Loch Ness Monster had died out some point in the 1930s. Which is interesting because that may relate to the whole cycle theory with these cycles of sightings and cycles of no sightings. She said that she was very excited about the photograph, she's very excited about her encounter, which is all well and good. But we look at this photograph, and we really can't draw many conclusions, to be honest. In fact, we almost can't draw any. We see a bit of the environment. We see that there's a railing or a bridge here in the background. We see a bit further into the background, maybe just beyond the railing, as we can see that leaves come up over it. We see the opposite shore, which appears to be a forest line, and then, of course, we see the water of the loch in the foreground, and right smack dab in the middle, we see what looks like an object, or a Loch Ness Monster, really, craning its neck. You can't help but say that when you look at this, yes, that looks a little bit like a Loch Ness Monster. It just does. However, when you look at it closer, you actually start to see things that make you maybe think otherwise. At first glance, this appears to be the shape of it right here. There's a dark head, a dark body, and in between a dark neck. However, I don't think there's actually a head that we're seeing there. If this is a Loch Ness Monster, there is obviously a head somewhere, but the dark spot that we're seeing there is not the head, and here's why. If we look in the background, we actually see that on the legs of these railings, on the legs of this railing of this bridge, there are dark spots as it approaches the water. And if we look at the leg that is right behind this object, we actually notice that what we thought was the head is actually just a dark spot on the leg. So while there still may be a head in this photograph, that right there is not it. So we're not left with a shape like this, we're left with a shape more like this, which is a little bit different, and definitely less craned, less classic Loch Ness Monster than we've been led to believe. But we still do have an object that is, I would say, evidently in the water, and that's because it cannot be a part of the leg because the leg would somehow be in front of all the rest, which makes no sense as a structure or as a design. It is in front of the landmass behind it and is in the water in front of the water's end line there. So we do have an object that is in the water, I'll give it that. But at the same time, I don't really know what it is. I can't really tell. It is a blurry photograph. We do get a little bit of detail. There does seem to be a darker spot on the object. If that's shadowing or if that's coloration, I'm not sure. But we do have some coloration. We actually can see, if we look very closely at what may be the neck of this creature, this object, what is being taken as the neck, I should say, we do see a very desaturated dark red color, which would suggest more so that this is an object in the foreground rather than an object in the background or an optical illusion of some kind. However, that's about all we can say about this alleged creature. Ultimately, I'm not sure what's in this photograph. Could it be debris or wood rising to the surface of the loch briefly? Yes, it could. Could it be a Loch Ness Monster? I suppose it could be, but it's such a low-quality photograph and it provides such little detail that I'm not entirely sure. I'm glad that Haley's excited about this. Maybe she did see something. But I don't see a reason that we can draw many conclusions from this photograph in particular. The next photograph was taken by Peter Jackson and his wife, Philippa Weirn, from Newport. And they took it while they were driving along a side of Loch Ness. I think it was the west side. And they're looking out onto the water, and they see this object in the water. And they describe it as about 150 meters from the shoreline that they're on. They take out their phones, they snap a few pictures, pretty classic scenario, and the object, I'm assuming, vanished into the water after that. If not, I'm not sure why they didn't take a video of it, but this is what we have. And it's definitely a bit more interesting than the last one because it's such an odd shape. It looks almost more classical than the last one because we can actually see the famous, the neck craning backwards to look back or something similar to that, if that is a neck. And we do see these two humps what could be two humps on what could be a creature swimming in the loch, which is very interesting. We see it has a darker coloration than the rest of its surroundings. But at the same time, I can't say how big this thing is because, quite frankly, I'm not sure how accurate their distance estimate was. The couple said that it was about 150 meters away from the shoreline. I'm not sure if that's true. If not, who knows how big this creature is. But if it is, it's a fairly big creature. Someone estimated it to be about 8 meters long. This was from the News Local website. They estimated it to be about 8 meters long, which is a fairly big creature. It's not huge, but it's fairly big. And if it's at a closer distance than that, we're looking at a smaller creature. But at the same time, if we're looking at it from a longer distance than 150 meters, it's actually bigger than 8 meters, which is very interesting. But all estimates aside, I don't know what creature, or if it is a creature, is that we're looking at. The reason I say what creature is because, and while I don't think it's the case in this photograph, I think it's important to know this about Loch Ness. In an interview, Peter Jackson actually mentioned that many people have seen deer swimming in Loch Ness and mistaken it for the Loch Ness Monster. I had no idea deer swam in Loch Ness occasionally, and that is very interesting, and I think that's very important to know. We've heard people talk about elephants in Loch Ness. That hasn't happened in God knows how long. But if we have deer in Loch Ness, I personally can't say that if I saw a deer in Loch Ness, I wouldn't mistake it for a hump and a long neck in front. That is what it looks like. That's what it looks like in water. That's all I'm saying. And I can see why people would mistake that creature for another. I'm sure it's a very unusual sight to see. It would be for me. And I think it's important that we all know that deer swim in Loch Ness occasionally, because it gives us another thing to say, well, maybe it was this, or, well, maybe you saw this, or a similar statement. It's important that we keep our minds open to the idea of cryptids, but it's also important that we keep our minds open enough to other options as well, to misidentification especially. And this adds another aspect, this adds another possible layer of misidentification to the list, and that is something that I believe people should keep in mind when talking about Loch Ness Monster photographs, footage, or even sightings. But the photograph itself definitely doesn't really seem to depict a deer. If it does, it is the most deformed deer I have ever seen. I kind of feel like, and I'm not saying, when I look at it, I think to myself, this could certainly be a faked photograph. This could honestly be fairly easily edited using a program like Photoshop. That's something that I use sometimes, and it wouldn't be all that difficult. But at the same time, I can't say for sure that it is, and if it isn't, this could be a log rising to the surface of Loch Ness. I'm not sure why all logs are shaped so weirdly at the bottom of water, apparently. But it could be that. It could very easily be that. It could be a strangely shaped log that rose to the top and then sank back down. And if it's neither of those, this could really only be something like the Loch Ness Monster. It's a very, very strange photograph. It yields about the same results ultimately as the last one. I can't really draw a clear conclusion because there are 3 options of what this could be. But it is more detailed than the last one, so it whittles it down to only 3 options instead of countless options. And it really is, I think, more interesting than the last one because we see such a strange shape in the water. But ultimately, the same thing comes up where it's interesting, and it is even more interesting than the last picture, but we still can't draw a really clear conclusion from what we're seeing here. Very unlike our next piece of evidence, which is the footage. I will start the footage on screen right now. As you can see here, the footage was taken by what I assume were tourists. They were on the road with other people who are all looking out onto the water, and they all see this object moving through. We can see there's a boat moving through here, and there is actually a person on the boat moving across. You can see them move right about there. Now, my first thought was that this could very easily be CGI, because it's such a flat water that day, it's such a calm water, and it's really such a non-discolored water. It's low enough quality to not really show the waves, and that could very easily be a transparent CGI image that they just slapped right onto there. The camera being so still, it wouldn't have to make the object shake with the footage. It would be very easy. And honestly, I was thinking that's what it was up until the camera does move. They go and disappears behind the trees, and they go to look for it, and you can see it moving from behind the trees. The leaves are still covering some of it, but you can see it moving. This is, of course, still possible in CGI, but it is more difficult than just fairly basic knowledge. If this is a CGI hoax, whoever made it made some pretty good effort and knew what they were doing and knew their stuff, which is, of course, entirely possible. It is a bit strange that the camera is so still. I'm not sure why they had a tripod with them or a stand with them. It could be for CGI purposes, or it could simply be that these tourists were looking for a good shot of the loch to use, or a good shot of Loch Ness nature to use. Ultimately, as the video goes on, it becomes less and less likely, although not impossible, that it's a CGI hoax. Which leaves us with another option for a hoax, which I find very unlikely, which is that it is someone underwater with some kind of hold-up stick that has the Loch Ness Monster's head on it. Ultimately, I'm thinking that's unlikely because, looking at the footage, we see that the object moving and the boat are actually moving at somewhat similar speeds, which is interesting. Because, you know, a boat's faster than someone swimming, evidently. And if this object is moving independently and it's not CGI, then we have a pretty fast swimmer moving this object if it is, in fact, an object that's being moved by someone. They're obviously not moving at the same speeds. The object in the water is considerably slower than the boat, but I wouldn't say that it's at swimming speed. If so, it's a very fast swimmer. Another thing is that the fact that there's a boat nearby suggests to me that it would be very dangerous, actually, for someone to be doing this, and only a dangerous idiot would do it. Could there be a dangerous idiot in the water right there? Yes, there could be. Why is he underwater for so long? I don't know. How is he holding his breath for that long while swimming with holding up a Loch Ness Monster's head above the surface? I don't know. Ultimately, as the video continues, not only do we lose credibility to the idea that it's CGI, we lose some credibility to it being a physical hoax. It's more likely that it's CGI than a physical hoax. I would say a physical hoax is about the least credible possibility out of all of these. And of course, it's not a deer swimming, it's not a log, it's evidently not either of those. So, if this is a living, breathing animal in the water, it is almost certainly an animal that we have not seen before that lives in Loch Ness that has a long, craneable neck. And it's moving fairly easily through the water. Not very fast, but easily. Could it be a human operating it below? Yes, but it's very unlikely. Could it be a CGI hoax? Yes, but it's not all that likely. It is still a bigger possibility than a physical hoax, but these people would need to know their stuff for it to work like that, and hey, maybe they do. I just don't think it's all that credible based on the later parts of the footage where it takes a little bit more expertise to make such a CGI image as that would be. Ultimately, this is our best piece of newest footage, or newest evidence really, because we have such a perplexing case with it. It's either CGI or it is a Loch Ness Monster. And if it's CGI, it's fairly impressive CGI. Someone worked hard on it, which is possible. But if it's not that, if it's the other 50-50 chance of that coin toss, then we have a Loch Ness Monster on video. And that is more conclusive than either photographs that we've seen, and it's more conclusive than a lot of historical pieces of evidence have been able to turn up for the existence of the monster. Ultimately, all these new photographs and this new piece of footage are very interesting, and most of them don't make good conclusions. But the footage in particular is very interesting and does make a clear, divisive conclusion. And I think that that's very important, and I think that's very interesting, because we could be looking at another piece of CGI that anyone could do, or we could be looking at a genuine video of a Loch Ness Monster. And that's the best that we've gotten in a very long time. Let me know what you all think about these new pieces of evidence. Do you think that there's more to it than I found? Do you think that these are more credible or incredible than I found them to be? Do you have encounters you'd like to share? Do you have more information on the backstories of these events that I don't know about or that I haven't talked about? Let me know your opinions. I'd love to hear them. With that being said, until next time.